Hello, I'm Pete Cataldi, Director of Resident Life here at Ann's Choice, and welcome to another edition of Resident Life Matters. Today we're talking about macular degeneration, and with me in studio are two guests, and we have on my immediate right Dawn Prall George, who's the Executive Director of the Macula Vision Research Foundation, and to Dawn's right is Lynn Rinaldi, who is the Outreach and Education Coordinator for the Macula Vision Research Foundation. So welcome to both of you, and thank you for coming on campus and talking to us about macular degeneration and what your organization does.
Thank you, Peter. We're happy to be here.
Yes, we certainly are.
So, you know, when people know the term, they've heard the term macular degeneration, they know that there are actually co-residents that have it. A number of residents do have that as a diagnosis. What are we talking about with macular degeneration?
Well, I think the best way to answer your question, Peter, is to talk about, first of all, what the disease is, and then second of all, the impact of it. So macular degeneration, for those of our audience members who are not aware of it, is a disease of the retina. And the retina is the back of the eye. The cornea is in the front, the retina is in the back, and the retina is attached to the optic nerve, which is attached to the brain. So many people would say that the eye is the gateway to the brain, and the retina is that connection. So the disease itself affects the macula, which is in the center of the retina, and the macula is in charge of, if you will, how your body works physiologically. The macula is in charge of seeing color and light and fine detail. And macular degeneration is a disease of the macula in the retina where it degenerates, so that people with macular degeneration are less able to see light and fine detail. And it is a leading cause of blindness in people age 50 and over. So it's a very serious disease.
Mm-hmm. And my understanding is that because of the location of the macula, the deficits in vision tend to occur in the center of the visual range?
That's correct. So for individuals who are watching this, who have macular degeneration, they know that it's almost like if you put a square, like a fuzzy square in the middle of each eye, and it blocks your central vision and makes it fuzzy, but you're able to see better in the periphery, so from side to side. So many individuals who have macular degeneration are kind of train themselves to be able to look at the sides so they can see better.
Right. And Lynn, I know you've worked with a senior population for about 32 years, and which I find so striking because you don't look old enough to have worked that many years. But.
Thank you very much for that compliment. Yes, 32 years at the same facility in Northeast Philadelphia.
All about that.
But then after 32 years, it was time to make a change, and I thought coming to Macula, MVRF would be the perfect, ideal place for me to go to still touch seniors in some way.
Right. And when we talk about macular degeneration, it's sometimes referred to as AMD, age-related macular degeneration. So you really haven't gone all that far afield.
That's right. I stayed right in the same age group.
Right. Right. And what age is somebody likely to be diagnosed with AMD?
Well, it's interesting you asked that because I would say 3 to 5 years ago, the belief was that macular degeneration in terms of the age significance was a population of 60 plus, and now all of the experts and the data shows that it's really individuals who are at early onset can begin at 50, age 50.
50 years of age. Mm-hmm. And with the lifespan, the length of time people are living, they could theoretically live with the disease for 30, 40 years or
even 50.
Absolutely, half their life. I mean, we all know that as medical science is advancing, we're all living longer, we're healthier longer, we're living the quality of life is much is much more improved in the latter years of our lifetime. So it's conceivable that someone could be diagnosed with age-related macular degeneration at, say, age 50 and have it for another 50 years.
Yeah. And the impact is so deep because we are visual animals. We get so much of our information through what it is that we see.
Absolutely. You know, everyone knows the cliche, the eyes are the window to the soul. And in fact, we, you know, being able to see, and we rely so much more on our vision than any other animal, so to speak. You know, dogs, cats, animals rely on much more on their scent, their sense of smell, and hearing, and we are definitely much more reliant as human beings on our sight. So it is actually the #1 fear that people have in terms of, you know, in their lifetime of losing their sight.
Yeah. And about how many people today in this country are diagnosed with AMD?
Well, that is a moving target because the estimation is there are currently 11 million Americans living with macular degeneration. And that includes early onset, okay? But the projections show, and this is from the National Eye Institute and other organizations, the projections are that the prevalence will be 20 million by the year 2020.
Because of people like me in the middle of the baby boom that are aging.
That's absolutely right. So that number keeps moving. And that's why we're around, because we want to make sure that millions of Americans and people who suffer from this, we find a cure for it.
Let's talk a little bit about the disease itself. I think we've sort of defined what it is, but I know it comes in 2 varieties, 2 types.
Right, right. There's wet, well, first of all, there's dry macular degeneration, and there's also wet macular degeneration.
And what's the difference, Dawn?
The difference is just to understand, wet macular degeneration has to do with the blood supply to the eye, to the retina. Because there's a, not to get too technical, but through the retina is how your eye receives blood. So, and the photoreceptors in your eye are part of that process. So they start to die, as well as what's called your RPE cells. And there's leakage, there's blood leakage around the eye when wet occurs. So, and also, I think the other important thing to remember about macular degeneration in general is that it's inflammatory. So like many other diseases, it is the inflammation system in the body. It's related to that.
Okay.
So the dry, you start out with dry, always, and you could go to wet, depending on how the disease progresses and how the degeneration happens. But just because you have dry does not mean that you will get wet.
And how would we define dry? If wet is the leakage of the vessels, fluids, blood, what's dry?
Dry is when usually it's the early onset stage, and it's when your photoreceptors start to see less and less light, okay? And then that's how the dry starts. So there's less leakage of blood vessels. There's not really any leakage of blood vessels at that point.
So many people that have dry macular degeneration would not necessarily progress to wet.
That's correct.
Is the disease always progressive?
That's a good question. Not always.
Okay.
It depends on the individual.
Okay.
So you could have dry age-related macular degeneration for a long time and not progress to wet.
And how would I know? I mean, how would I know that I even have a problem? Am I going to have symptoms that will prompt me to go to my doctor, or who might send me to an ophthalmologist? Or is it something that can be detected even if I have no symptoms?
Well, certainly in visual acuity tests is when, depending on who your healthcare professional is that you see, whether you see an optometrist or an ophthalmologist or a retina specialist, depending on where you seek your healthcare. What they really need to do is notice in your vision acuity tests that you are getting worse, your vision is denigrating. Okay, that's a first sign. And the second sign is that you as the individual notice that you can't see as clearly in front of you. Okay, again, because remember, it's all about the central vision. Okay, so that's one indication, and again, that can come out through vision testing. Okay, and then the other potential symptom is that you start to see a coloring in your eye. Okay, it's the change in color in your actual lens of your eye. But in order to be properly diagnosed, and again, I'm not a physician, but in order to be properly diagnosed, you need to have what's called an OCT, which is basically an image of your eye where a retina specialist or an ophthalmologist can actually see the macular degeneration.
And they could identify what type it is and the
Yes.
severity and
But
so
you need
forth.
that procedure to be entirely accurate about the diagnosis.
Yeah. So we know it impacts a broad swath of people. That
Absolutely.
number is going to grow as the population ages. So let's talk a little bit about the foundation.
Sure. Well, macular degeneration as a disease has been around for a very long time. In fact, it's probably difficult to tell how long humans have been suffering from it because it went undiagnosed for many, many years. In fact, as recent ago as 25, 30 years, there was very little known about the retina. Okay. Most of the science was focused on the cornea, which is the front of the eye, and of course we've all heard about glaucoma, cataracts,
Sure,
and all of that.
certainly.
And also, it was largely believed that it was a consequence of just growing older, that you couldn't see as well, and that it was just physical changes in the aging with the aging process. So our co-founders, Karen and Herb Lotman, Karen's mother suffered from macular degeneration, and it was through their own personal experience and watching her and the pain and suffering that she had, and she was basically blind from it, because remember, it is the leading cause of blindness in people over 50. So they were so concerned about that they contacted, at the time, one of the most prevalent ophthalmologists in the country, who was at Yale. His name was Dr. Marvin Sears. And Karen and Herb reached out to him and asked him, and again, this was in the 90s, and asked him to find out what research was going on around the world with the retina, and what, if anything, was known about macular degeneration. And so it was with those two very simple questions that was the genesis of creating Macular Vision Research Foundation. You want to know what the answers were?
Sure.
The answers were this. Dr. Sears came back to the Lotmans and said, a few weeks later, and said, well, I have some news for you. Number one, very little research out there about the retina. We frankly just don't know a whole lot about it. Number two is that macular degeneration, the attitude is that's an old person's disease. When you get old, you can't see as well. So people don't care that much about it. And of course, the Lotmans, being who they are, and having personally experienced the impact, the devastating impact of the disease, said, well, that's ridiculous. That makes no sense. We're going to do something about that, and we're going to change that. And so Karen said to Herb, let's start a foundation. So in 1997, the foundation was formed. We're 17 years old, and we've given $20 million in grant research funding to scientists, the top scientists and researchers all over the world, who are conducting studies and research on the retina and other retina and macular degeneration and other retina-related diseases.
And when we were talking before we went on camera, I know we were talking about cancer and the fact that cancer sort of morphs and it changes and there's different cells, and it's hard to, much like the common cold, it's hard to track it down. It doesn't mean at some point we won't have huge advances in helping to stop and cure cancer. But when we're talking about macular degeneration, it's a little bit different.
Absolutely. Again, I'm not a scientist or a doctor, but I will tell you that we know, here's what we know. We know that the research, there is a cure out there. We know that because we have advanced the early onset of the disease, the science that backs that up, and the research, the basic science that it takes at the molecular level to better understand that. I mean, one of the major breakthroughs and advances that MVRF can take credit for is really advancing that science to the point where scientists in the clinical world now understand much better, much more about the retina, okay? And in order to cure a disease, you need to understand the part of the body in which it takes place. That makes sense, right? So, because we are laser focused, if you will, on just the retina, we're able to put the resources necessary toward research on that. So that's one reason we know that it's different than cancer. And you're right, there's cellular deviation and cellular change in cancer. And that's not necessarily the case with macular degeneration. Although I will say that the macular degeneration is incredibly complex as a disease because the retina is. If you think about it, your eye, the eye, is the only exposed organ in your entire body, okay? So of all the organs in your body, the eye is the only one that's exposed to the outside world. So, and it has a huge job to do because, as I said earlier, it connects to the brain. It opens us up to our central nervous system when we wake up in the morning. It does all these complicated things through light. And so it is incredibly complex as an organ, but the disease itself we have isolated. So that's why we believe there will be a cure, and obviously preventions and treatments and slowing down the progression of the disease are all the things that are on the table for research. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
It does make sense. And I know you really have reached out nationally with researchers that are working on this issue. And I know they convene every so often and they talk about what the status is, and they actually help each other out. All such a positive sign that there's this much of a coalition that's working to address it. So what's the process? You've given out $20 million. How does that work out in the field with these researchers working on this very specific issue?
That's a really good question. And I think it's what sets us apart, because if the audience hasn't determined this by now, our mission is to find a cure. And our mission is to alleviate the pain and suffering for millions and millions of people for generations to come who suffer from the single disease of macular degeneration and then other retina-related diseases. And we do that through funding groundbreaking research that's the most credible scientists in the world, actually, and who have the most promise of reaching finding those cures and finding those breakthroughs, okay? So that's what makes us different. So we have a scientific advisory board. It's international. These are the top retina scientists in the world on our board and have been with us, most of them for 20 years, about 20 years since we started. One of them is a PhD, MD, by the way, so we have a clinician presence. So we get an understanding of that as well, voice, if you will. So our scientific advisory board know who is out there all over the world who's doing, again, who is the most credible, doing the most promising research. So they bring this group together, they bring themselves together as a group, the advisory board, and they decide who of these researchers is eligible for funding based on what projects they're conducting. And because that, even though it's a big wide world out there, you can imagine that this is a finite group of experts who know what they're doing when it comes to retina research. So we develop that list every year. Our grants happen on an annual basis. So every year a list is developed of the top people. Then we invite them, it's a closed system, or process. So we invite them to submit a proposal to us for a project that they would like to be funded by us. And then our scientific advisory board scores all those proposals, and the top scoring proposals are the ones that get funded. So from year to year, we fund anywhere from 5 to 6 projects. The total is $300,000 per project for 3 years. So that's $100,000 per year for 3 years to each scientist. And remember that science and research happens in an academic setting. So all of our researchers are affiliated with an academic research organization, or many of them are at some of the top eye institutes in the world. And we fund them. They report, we keep tabs on their progress. We get reports from them. Our scientific advisors will review all of that. And then, we hope that they publish their findings, and that advances and share them, and that advances the science, again, to reach out into the next stage, which is the clinical and bioscience world.
Nice system. And you are a 501c3?
We are a public charity. We're a 501c3. I want people to know another thing that makes us incredibly unique, and this was the vision of our co-founders, the Lotman family, is that we receive donations from individuals, from foundations, from the government, from corporations, and every funding source out there. And anyone who gives us money, 100% of that donation goes to the research, because the Karen and Herb Lotman Foundation underwrites all of our fundraising and administrative expenses. So this pen that I brought from the office, Lynn, my salary, all of us, we're underwritten by the Karen and Herb Lotman Foundation, so that 100% of the public donations, the donations from other individuals, goes directly to the research.
Terrific.
There's not a whole lot of organizations out there.
No,
who can say that.
I wouldn't think so. That's quite a badge of honor.
We're a good return on investment.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, we've defined a little bit about macular degeneration, the dry, the wet. In terms of treatment and prospects, what happens with dry? If I've just been diagnosed with dry macular degeneration, what do I do?
Well, the reality is, unfortunately, that there's very little that can be done right now.
That's right. But if you smoke, you want to make sure you stop smoking.
I quit yesterday.
Okay, very good. You want to eat right. A lot of greeny vegetables,
Right.
and stay away from the greasy things. You want to make sure you wear sunglasses every time you go outside. And you really want to monitor your blood pressure. Blood pressure too high is not going to be too good for your eyes either.
Right.
And
So
exercise.
lots of
exercise will play a role in all
but
of
that's with
that.
everything.
Yeah.
So really, it's just living and eating and doing everything right for your eyes and for the rest of your body.
Are there some over-the-counter things I can take? Should I take vitamins? Should I take just a general vitamin?
There are vitamins out there that you can take, and
For your eye
for your eye health.
Okay.
And there-
Absolutely.
we don't we try to tell folks that we don't recommend a particular one brand over another.
Right.
But what we do advocate for people is to make sure that you're taking an eye vitamin. So there are brands out there, Ocuvite, Preservision, and look on the label, and they're not inexpensive. But just because one is more costly than the other does not mean it's necessarily more effective.
Okay.
But you also want to check with your eye specialist.
Absolutely.
Smart.
You don't
That's
want to
always
just
a-
go out and
yeah.
pull one off
You wanna
the.
just take our word for
That's
it. We know a
right.
lot, but we're not.
Yeah. You want
Yeah.
to make sure it doesn't intermix with any other medications, but just check as
Yeah.
you would normally check with taking anything over the counter.
Well, that makes sense.
That's right.
If I have been diagnosed with wet, what are my prospects? Is there anything out there that may give me some hope?
Sure. That's where the science can really do something and really can help. And if you're diagnosed with wet, and again, you could have wet in one eye. Just because you've been diagnosed doesn't mean it's both eyes. You could have dry in one eye, wet in the other. I mean, there's all the obvious combinations. But when you are diagnosed with wet, again, your retina specialist or ophthalmologist may recommend you to be a candidate for there's actually shots. Okay, there's a pharmaceutical drug out there.
So we're talking about injections right in the
eye. I know that sounds horrific. I've heard from hundreds and hundreds of people who go through this all the time that in terms of the trade-off of being able to possibly see better and treat the disease, it's worth it for many people. Now, it's not, again, experts tell us, and we know this, that the shots, the injections are not for everyone. Again, your doctor has to prescribe that. But what we do know is that for most people who take them, who get them, and there's 3 different kinds out there, Lucentis, Aventis, and Eylea, okay, they're the brands. But we do know that if the sooner you get you're diagnosed with it, again, early onset, the better. And the sooner that you get on some kind of drug therapy program, the better. And that it can move the needle for you in terms of improving your vision. But that varies from individual to individual. And these shots are anywhere from every 3 months to some doctors recommend once a month. I mean, it just depends on the regimen that your doctor will put you on. But they can help, and they can slow the progression of the wet macular degeneration. They cannot reverse it because macular degeneration is not reversible right now.
Okay.
And there are other there's telescopic implants, there's other assistive technologies out there for people. But again, if you need to be a candidate for those kinds of things, then that's something you would want to talk to your medical professional
With
about.
your doc, sure. Well, obviously education is an important part of this. The more that people know, the better off they're going to be. And Lynn, we're actually going to be hosting something here, right at Ann's Choice in our Performing Arts Center.
That's right, right here at Ann's Choice. We're going to be here on June 24th at 2 p.m. in the Performing Arts Center.
Excellent.
And I'll be bringing the whole team out, and we're going to have many gadgets for you to look at. We're going to be talking about the latest research. We're going to talk about prevention, treatments, and low vision techniques. So the whole team's going to be here, and it's going to be a great time here at Ann's Choice.
Excellent.
And a lot of education is going to happen here.
And there's no tickets needed for this.
No
This is free.
tickets, and it's free. That's the word, free. And anybody can come. Bring your family members, bring anybody who might have an idea that they have this disease, or a friend or a family member. It's open to everybody, family, residents, and coworkers.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, this has been very, very informative. I want to thank both of you for coming and talking about
Thank you.
your foundation and about macular degeneration.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We're happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
It's been very exciting.
No one's ever said that on this show. That's very good. Well, that wraps up another edition of Resident Life Matters. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.